I am Lucille, 62 years old, a retired nurse from Chicago. I have been living alone since my husband passed away 5 years ago. My son David and I were always close growing up, but things changed after he married Stephanie. Our relationship became more strained with each passing year. Last Thanksgiving, I hosted dinner at my home. After they left abruptly, I discovered a note on my dining table that would change everything. If you're watching from somewhere that values respect for elders, tap that like button and subscribe. I'm about to share what happened when my own family treated me like their personal maid and how I finally stood up for myself. I was raised in a close-knit family where respect and hard work were our guiding principles. My parents taught me that family supports each other through thick and thin, and that lesson stayed with me throughout my life. I carried these values into my 35-year nursing career, where I helped countless patients and taught compassion to younger nurses. During nursing school, I met the love of my life, Frank. We connected immediately over our shared passion for helping others. We married after graduation and spent 40 wonderful years together. Frank was kind, thoughtful, and the most hard-working man I knew. Together, we built a beautiful life centered around our family values. We were blessed with our only son, David, who became the light of our lives. We raised him with the same values that guided us: respect, integrity, and the importance of family. Frank built our modest 3-bedroom house with his own hands when David was just 2 years old. It wasn't fancy by any means, but it was filled with love and memories. Every corner of this home holds a special memory. David's height marks on the kitchen doorframe, the backyard treehouse Frank built, the garden we planted together every spring. Frank was diagnosed with aggressive cancer 6 years ago. Those final months were difficult, but I was grateful to be able to care for him at home until the end. Being a nurse gave me the skills to make his last days as comfortable as possible. David was there for us too, visiting every weekend and helping around the house. When Frank passed away 5 years ago, David stayed with me for 2 weeks, making sure I was okay before returning to his apartment in the city. Adjusting to widowhood was the hardest thing I ever experienced. The silence in the house was deafening at first, but slowly I created a new life for myself. I focused on my gardening, joined a book club, and started volunteering at the local hospital 3 days a week. My neighbors, especially Martha next door, who had also lost her husband, became my support system. David was such a wonderful child growing up. He was always kind and respectful, the type of boy who would make Mother's Day cards weeks in advance. He was thoughtful with everyone, not just family. His teachers always commented on his helpfulness and consideration for others. I remember when he was 10, he saved his allowance for 3 months to buy Frank a birthday present, a fishing tackle box that Frank treasured. David excelled in school, particularly in math and science. He decided to study computer science in college, and Frank and I supported his dreams completely. We weren't wealthy, but we made sure he graduated without student loans. He landed a job as a software engineer right after graduation and quickly advanced in his career. Even after moving to his own apartment, David maintained our close relationship. He established a Sunday dinner tradition, coming over every week without fail. When he faced challenges at work or went through a tough breakup with his college girlfriend, we talked through everything together. I was always there to listen, not to judge, and he knew that. I was so proud of the man my son had become: responsible, kind, successful in his career, but never letting it change his values. He reminded me so much of Frank in the way he carried himself with quiet integrity. Our bond seemed unbreakable. That was before he met Stephanie. David met Stephanie at a tech conference 4 years ago. He called me the very next day, unusually excited about a woman he had just met. Stephanie worked in marketing for a major tech company, and David was immediately impressed by her confidence and ambition. Within a month, he brought her to our Sunday dinner. I still remember that first meeting clearly. Stephanie arrived in a luxury car dressed impeccably in designer clothes. She was undeniably beautiful and polished, from a wealthy family in Connecticut. While she was perfectly pleasant on the surface, I noticed how her eyes assessed everything in my modest home with a slightly dismissive glance. When David proudly showed her the handmade cabinet Frank had built, she smiled thinly and said, "How quaint. My parents have an antique collection curated by their interior designer." David didn't seem to notice these subtle put-downs. He was completely enamored with her. I told myself I was being overly sensitive and tried my best to make her feel welcome. Their relationship progressed at lightning speed. What concerned me was how quickly David began changing his habits to accommodate her preferences. Our Sunday dinners became less frequent. When I called, he often couldn't talk because they were at some exclusive event or dinner with her colleagues. Within 6 months, they were engaged. The wedding planning was my first real taste of being deliberately excluded. Traditional mother-of-the-groom activities were handled by Stephanie's mother. When I offered to help address invitations or assist with flowers, Stephanie told me everything was already handled by professionals. My input on the guest list was ignored. Many of our family friends who had known David since childhood weren't invited because Stephanie didn't want too many old people at her wedding. The wedding itself was an elaborate affair at an expensive resort. I felt like an afterthought seated at a table far from the main party with distant relatives. Stephanie's family dominated the event with her father giving a 20-minute speech while I wasn't even invited to say a few words about my only son. After the honeymoon, David and Stephanie bought an expensive house in an upscale neighborhood, despite my gentle suggestion that they might want to start with something more modest and build equity. David's explanation revealed Stephanie's influence. Stephanie says we need to live in the right neighborhood to make the right connections. The changes in David became more pronounced. Our Sunday dinners were completely canceled because Stephanie instituted couple time on weekends. Phone calls became brief and infrequent. When they did visit, Stephanie would make subtle remarks about my home needing updating or my cooking being basic but charming. I tried not to take offense and focused instead on maintaining my relationship with David. 2 years after the wedding, they had their daughter Emma. I was overjoyed at becoming a grandmother. I knitted blankets and bought thoughtful gifts, but my joy was dampened by the limited access I had to my granddaughter. Stephanie always had an excuse why I couldn't visit, or why they couldn't bring Emma to see me. When Emma was just 3 months old, Stephanie hired a full-time nanny named Grace, despite the fact that Stephanie had reduced her work schedule to part-time. When I offered to help with childcare 1 or 2 days a week, Stephanie quickly shut me down. "We prefer professional childcare, Lucille," she said dismissively. "Grace has training in early childhood development and follows our specific parenting philosophy." Family gatherings became increasingly uncomfortable. Last Christmas, I was invited to their home, but was assigned to wash dishes while everyone else exchanged gifts. At Easter, I overheard Stephanie telling her mother that my present for Emma was just going straight to Goodwill. Through it all, David became increasingly passive around his wife. The confident, kind-hearted son I raised seemed to disappear in her presence, agreeing with whatever she said and making excuses for her behavior. When I tried to talk to him privately about how I was feeling, he would say, "That's just Stephanie's way," or "You're being too sensitive, Mom." I watched with a heavy heart as Stephanie methodically controlled every family interaction with David, becoming her willing accomplice. Still, I held on to hope that things would improve, especially for Emma's sake. I wanted my granddaughter to know how much her grandmother loved her, even if her mother seemed determined to keep us apart. After 3 years of being excluded from hosting family gatherings, I was genuinely surprised when David called in early November to ask if I would host Thanksgiving dinner. I was thrilled at the opportunity to welcome my family into my home again and immediately started planning. For weeks I prepared everything with loving attention to detail. I deep-cleaned every room, even spaces they wouldn't see. I pulled out my best linens that had been Frank's mother's and polished the silverware we had received as wedding gifts. I wanted everything to be perfect. I spent hours researching recipes that might please Stephanie's refined palate while still preparing the traditional dishes David had always loved. I ordered a heritage turkey from a local farm, selected the freshest vegetables, and splurged on expensive ingredients I normally wouldn't buy for myself. I also put special effort into making the day wonderful for my 2-year-old granddaughter Emma. I baked her favorite chocolate chip cookies after confirming her preferences with David. I found a beautiful children's book about gratitude and wrapped it along with a handmade stuffed animal I had sewn myself. David called several times to confirm plans and discuss the menu. Each time he seemed genuinely excited about coming home for the holiday. But invariably, Stephanie would call back later with adjustments and special requests. "Stephanie is gluten-sensitive now," David would explain apologetically. Or, Stephanie wonders if you could make the cranberry sauce without sugar and use honey instead. Each time I accommodated every request without complaint. The day before Thanksgiving, Stephanie called directly, which was unusual. "Lucille," she said, using the formal name she always called me instead of Mom. "We'll be arriving at 1 instead of noon, and we'll need to leave by 4 at the latest. Also, Emma has been having tantrums around unfamiliar people, so please don't make a big fuss when you see her." I felt my heart sink at the shortened visit, but assured her I understood. I was up at dawn on Thanksgiving Day, putting the turkey in the oven and making final preparations. Everything was ready by noon, but they didn't arrive until 1:30. When they finally pulled up, I noticed that their car seemed unusually full. David carried Emma, while Stephanie directed Grace the nanny to bring in several bags. I was surprised to see Grace accompanying them on a family holiday, but welcomed her warmly. "Happy Thanksgiving," I said, reaching out to hug my granddaughter. Emma started to smile at me, but Stephanie quickly interjected. "Emma's been car sick. She needs to sit quietly for a while," she said, taking Emma from David and settling her on the couch with a tablet. My carefully prepared children's table with special plates and activities went unused. Stephanie immediately began critiquing my home. "Oh, you're still using these old curtains, and this carpet really needs to be updated, don't you think?" She ran her finger along a shelf and examined it for dust, while Grace looked embarrassingly at the floor. The dinner itself was strained. I had set the table with care using my mother's china and placing name cards at each setting. Stephanie immediately rearranged the seating so that she and David sat at one end with Emma, while Grace and I sat at the other. Stephanie dominated the conversation with stories about their country club memberships and the exclusive preschool Emma would be attending next year. Whenever I tried to engage David in conversation about his work or share news about mutual friends, Stephanie would interrupt with her own topic. I noticed David's discomfort in his tight smile and the way he kept glancing at his watch. He barely touched the foods that had once been his favorites. Whenever Emma showed interest in something I said or offered, Stephanie would quickly distract her. Throughout the meal, Stephanie kept checking her phone and exchanging glances with Grace. At one point, I overheard her whisper harshly to David, "I told you this would be a waste of time. We should have gone straight there." Just as I was about to serve the pumpkin pie I had baked from scratch, Stephanie abruptly stood up. "We need to get going," she announced. "Traffic will be terrible if we wait any longer." David looked conflicted, but stood as well. "Sorry, Mom. We really do need to hit the road." "But I haven't given Emma her present yet," I said, trying to keep disappointment from my voice. "Mail it," Stephanie said dismissively. "Grace, get Emma's coat." The goodbye was rushed and awkward. David gave me a quick hug, mumbling another apology. Stephanie barely nodded in my direction as she hustled Emma and Grace out the door. They left so quickly that Emma's favorite stuffed animal was left behind on the couch. I stood at the door watching them drive away, feeling the familiar ache of being an afterthought in their lives. When I returned to clear the half-eaten meal, I noticed an envelope propped against the centerpiece that hadn't been there before. The card inside read, "Family trip, clean the house before we're back. We'll be gone for a week. Here's a list of what needs to be done." Attached was a detailed typed list of cleaning tasks including deep clean guest bedroom closets, organize basement storage, wash all windows inside and out, and polish silver and china after use. The list was signed with a cursive, "Thanks S." I sat down heavily in Frank's old chair, the card trembling in my hands. They hadn't come for Thanksgiving dinner at all. They had come to drop off a to-do list before their vacation, a vacation I knew nothing about, but apparently even the nanny was included. I stared at the card for what felt like hours, my Thanksgiving dinner growing cold on the table. The realization that this visit had been planned with deception from the beginning cut deeply. They had never intended to spend the holiday with me. They had only stopped by to deliver cleaning instructions before their family vacation. A family vacation that included their nanny, but not me. The house felt eerily quiet as I sat alone at my beautifully set table. I ran my fingers over Frank's empty chair, wondering what he would say if he could see how our son and his wife were treating me. Frank had always been my strength, my moral compass when things got difficult. "Oh, Frank," I whispered to the empty room, "where did I go wrong with our boy?" I picked up my phone and called my closest friend Martha. Her voice was cheerful when she answered. Her children and grandchildren were still there celebrating. "Martha," my voice cracked, "I need to talk. Can you come over later?" She must have heard the pain in my voice because she immediately excused herself from her family gathering and arrived at my door 20 minutes later. I showed her the card and the cleaning list. "Those entitled disrespectful—" Martha didn't finish her sentence, her face flushed with anger on my behalf. "Lucille, you cannot let them walk all over you like this. You're not their maid. You're David's mother and Emma's grandmother." "But what can I do if I refuse? They'll just pull further away. I'll see Emma even less than I do now," I said, voicing my greatest fear. "Do you really see Emma now, on their terms for brief controlled visits where you're treated like an outsider?" Martha asked gently. "Sometimes you have to be willing to risk losing what you barely have to gain something real." Martha stayed late into the evening, helping me package up the uneaten food and cleaning the kitchen. But after she left, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake replaying years of small slights and growing disrespect that I had tolerated for David's sake. Around 3 a.m, I got up and went to the closet where I kept old photo albums. I found pictures of David growing up, his gap-toothed smile in elementary school, his proud stance beside his science fair project the day Frank taught him to drive. I found drawings he had made for me, stick figures labeled "My Forever Family" with 3 smiling faces. What happened to that boy who understood the value of family? The contrast between the son I raised and the man who would allow his wife to treat his mother this way was heartbreaking. The next morning I read the cleaning list again with fresh eyes. The condescension dripped from every directive. Make sure to dust the ceiling fan blades. Don't use harsh chemicals on the hardwood. As if I didn't know how to clean my own home after living here for 30 years. Something shifted inside me. A lifetime of putting others first, of keeping the peace, of making excuses for bad behavior. It all suddenly felt exhausting and wrong. Frank had always told me, "Your kindness is your strength, Lucy, but don't let it become your weakness." I decided it was time to establish some boundaries. This wasn't just about a cleaning list. It was about basic respect and dignity. I called Arthur, Frank's best friend, who was an attorney, and explained the situation. I needed to understand my legal position before taking any action. "Lucille, the house is solely in your name since Frank's passing," Arthur confirmed after checking the property records. "They have absolutely no legal right to demand anything regarding your property. In fact, legally speaking, they're guests in your home, and you have every right to determine who has access." "What about Emma? Could they prevent me from seeing my granddaughter?" I asked, voicing my deepest fear. Arthur sighed. "Unfortunately, grandparent rights are limited. But ask yourself, are you really seeing her now in any meaningful way? And is this the relationship example you want her growing up observing?" His questions echoed Martha's from the night before. The truth was painful, but clarifying. "Thank you, Arthur. I know what I need to do," I said with more confidence than I'd felt in years. I spent the rest of the day researching and planning. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity and hopefully establishing healthier relationships moving forward. I needed to make a statement that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. With a clear plan in mind, I began methodically implementing it the very next day. My first call was to a reputable locksmith who could come immediately. "I'd like all the locks changed on my doors," I told him when he arrived, "and I'd like a new security system installed as well." The locksmith was efficient, replacing the front and back door locks within an hour. He recommended a security company that could install cameras and a modern alarm system. I scheduled them for later that afternoon. Next, I began the process of carefully packing up all of David, Stephanie, and Emma's belongings that had accumulated in my home over the years. There wasn't much of David's left, mostly childhood memorabilia that I organized with care, separating items of true sentimental value from things he had likely forgotten. Stephanie had left designer clothes in her closet in the guest room, expensive toiletries in the bathroom, and various items she had brought to improve my home but never actually used. As I was organizing these items, I discovered something disturbing. Several of my personal financial documents had been moved from my office to the guest room nightstand. Among them was a property tax assessment and a handwritten note in Stephanie's elegant script that read, "House valued at $340,000. Could sell for $375,000 with minimal updates. Discuss elder care options." My hands shook as I realized what this meant. Stephanie hadn't just been criticizing my home. She had been assessing it as an asset to be liquidated. They had been planning to pressure me to sell my home and move into some type of senior facility, likely using the proceeds for their own purposes. This discovery strengthened my resolve. I contacted a storage facility and rented a climate-controlled unit for 3 months, paying in advance. My neighbor's son helped me transport everything to the unit, and I created a detailed inventory of all items stored. For Emma, I set aside a special box of her favorite toys and books that she played with at my house. I couldn't bear the thought of my granddaughter feeling punished for her parents' behavior. The security company arrived and installed cameras covering my front and back entrances, along with a modern alarm system I could monitor from my phone. The technician showed me how to view the footage remotely and set up alerts. "Are you having trouble with break-ins in the neighborhood?" he asked conversationally. "No," I replied. "Just establishing some boundaries." That evening, I had a virtual consultation with a family therapist. I needed guidance on how to handle the inevitable confrontation in a healthy way. "What you're doing isn't punitive, it's protective," the therapist assured me. "You're not cutting them off, you're establishing conditions for engagement based on mutual respect." The therapist helped me draft a letter to David explaining my actions and my boundaries moving forward. The letter was firm, but loving, making it clear that this was about respect, not rejection. With everything in place, I spent the weekend reclaiming my home. I moved furniture back to where I wanted it, rather than where Stephanie had insisted it should go during her visits. I replaced the guest room bedding with a beautiful quilt I had made years ago. I rehung family photos that Stephanie had suggested were cluttering the walls. Each small act of reclamation felt healing. This wasn't just about standing up to disrespect. It was about remembering who I was beyond my role as David's mother. I was Lucille Davis, a retired nurse who had cared for hundreds of patients, a woman who had loved deeply and built a life of meaning, a person deserving of basic dignity. By the time I received notification that their return flight had landed, I felt calm and prepared. I knew exactly when they would arrive at my house because Stephanie had included their detailed itinerary with the cleaning instructions. According to the schedule, they would stop at my house before heading home so they could inspect the cleaning job and collect some items they had stored in my guest room. I settled into Frank's old armchair with a cup of tea, the security camera feed displayed on my tablet. Right on schedule, their luxury SUV pulled into my driveway. The security camera showed David, Stephanie, Emma, and Grace approaching my front door, loaded down with luggage and shopping bags. They looked tanned and relaxed from their vacation. David had Emma on his shoulders, while Stephanie led the way with confident strides. I could almost feel her satisfaction, imagining my week of servitude cleaning their things while they enjoyed their family trip. I watched as David reached for his key and tried to insert it into the lock. The confusion on his face was immediate. He tried again, jiggling the key more forcefully. Stephanie noticed something was wrong and stepped forward, saying something I couldn't hear through the camera. She took the key from him and tried herself, growing visibly frustrated when it wouldn't work. Stephanie began pounding on the door while David pulled out his phone, presumably to call me. My phone began ringing, but I let it go to voicemail. After 3 attempts, David left a message. "Mom, we're at your house, but our key isn't working. Can you come open the door? We just got back from our trip." I continued watching as Stephanie's knocking became more aggressive. Her body language shifted from annoyed to angry. Several neighbors emerged from their homes, curious about the commotion. Grace looked uncomfortable, trying to distract Emma by pointing at birds in the yard. After about 15 minutes, Stephanie's composure completely dissolved. She was gesturing wildly, her face flushed with anger. David seemed to be trying to calm her down while looking increasingly embarrassed by her behavior. Through the camera's microphone, I could now hear her raised voice. "This is ridiculous. We have a right to access this house. My things are in there." I decided it was time to make my appearance. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked calmly to the front door. When I opened it, Stephanie was mid-rant, her finger pointed at David accusingly. Her face when she saw me was a study in shock. She had clearly expected me to be absent, or at least apologetic. Instead, I stood in my doorway with calm dignity, blocking their entrance. "Hello," I said evenly. "Grandma," Emma called happily from David's shoulders. I smiled warmly at her, but maintained my position. "Lucille, what's going on?" Stephanie demanded, trying to regain her composure. "Our key doesn't work." "I had the locks changed," I said simply. "What? Why would you do that without telling us we have things inside?" Stephanie's voice rose sharply. "You left me detailed cleaning instructions before your vacation," I replied. "I found your note about selling my house and elder care options while packing your belongings." The color drained from Stephanie's face. She actually swayed slightly, placing her hand on the porch railing for support. David looked completely confused, glancing between his wife and me. "What note? What's going on?" he asked. "Perhaps you didn't know," I said to David, "but Stephanie has been assessing my home's value and planning my future without my input. I found her notes when I was packing up your things." "Packing?" David's confusion deepened. "Mom, I don't understand." Stephanie had recovered enough to try taking control of the situation. "This is absurd. We just need to get our things and go home. We've had a long flight." "Your belongings are safe," I assured them. "I've placed everything in a climate-controlled storage unit." I handed David an envelope containing the storage information key and inventory list. "The unit is paid for 3 months. That should give you plenty of time to make arrangements." Stephanie's face flushed deep red, then alarmingly pale. Without warning, she actually fainted, collapsing onto my front porch with a dramatic thud. Grace rushed forward to check on her while David stood frozen in shock, still holding Emma. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private," I suggested, nodding toward the neighbors who were watching with undisguised interest. "There's a cafe 2 blocks down where we can talk." Grace helped a groggy Stephanie to her feet. "I'll take her to get some water," she offered, guiding Stephanie toward their car. David set Emma down and looked at me with hurt confusion. "Mom, why would you do this?" "Let's talk at the cafe," I repeated gently. "Emma might enjoy their cookies." 20 minutes later, we were seated at a quiet corner table at Rosie's Cafe. Stephanie had recovered enough to sip water, but remained uncharacteristically silent. Emma was happily coloring with crayons the waitress had provided. "I want to be clear," I began. "This isn't about punishment. It's about boundaries and respect." I calmly explained how their treatment had affected me. The exclusion, the criticism, the demands, and finally, the discovery that they had been planning to pressure me out of my own home. "I never saw any note about selling your house," David insisted, looking genuinely shocked. "Perhaps you didn't," I acknowledged, "but it exists in Stephanie's handwriting along with my financial documents that had been moved to your guest room." Stephanie finally spoke, her voice tight. "We were just exploring options. You're getting older living alone in that big house. We were concerned about you." "If you were concerned, you could have had a conversation with me," I pointed out. "Instead, you made plans behind my back while treating me like an unpaid housekeeper." David looked increasingly uncomfortable as I outlined the pattern of disrespect. The excluded invitations, the criticism of my home, and cooking the limited access to Emma, and finally the Thanksgiving dinner that was merely a pit stop before their vacation. "Did you know," I asked David directly, "that the Thanksgiving dinner was just a cover to drop off cleaning instructions?" His silence and averted eyes gave me my answer. "I raised you to be better than this, David," I said quietly. "Your father would be so disappointed." Those words seemed to finally break through. David's eyes filled with tears. "What do you want from us?" Stephanie demanded, regaining some of her usual sharpness. "Respect," I said simply. "I'm not asking to control your lives. I'm asking to be treated with basic courtesy and kindness. I'm asking to have a relationship with my granddaughter that isn't constantly controlled and limited. I'm asking my son to remember the values he was raised with." I outlined my new boundaries clearly. I would not be providing free housekeeping. I would not tolerate criticism of my home cooking or lifestyle. I would expect to be included in family events in a meaningful way. And most importantly, I would have regular, respectful visits with Emma. If these terms aren't acceptable, I concluded. Then I think it's better we acknowledge that now, rather than continuing this painful charade. Stephanie's face had gone through a kaleidoscope of emotions as I spoke. Anger, disbelief, calculation, and finally a kind of grudging reassessment. She realized she had underestimated me. "This is emotional blackmail," she said finally. "You're using your relationship with Emma as leverage." "No," I corrected her. "I'm stating what I need to have a healthy relationship with my family. You're free to choose whether those terms work for you." Emma looked up from her coloring. "Grandma, can I come see your garden tomorrow? I want to see if the butterflies are still there." Before Stephanie could answer, I smiled at Emma. "That would be lovely, sweetheart, but we'll need to check with your mommy and daddy first." All eyes turned to Stephanie and David. This was the moment of truth. Stephanie stood abruptly. "Emma, we're leaving. Grace, get her things." The nanny looked uncomfortable but complied. David remained seated, clearly torn. "David," Stephanie's voice was sharp, "we're going." For the first time in years, I saw my son stand his ground with his wife. "You take Emma home. I'm going to stay and talk with my mother." Stephanie's eyes widened in shock. "Fine," she snapped after a moment. "But this isn't over." She grabbed Emma's hand and marched out, Grace trailing behind apologetically. David and I sat in silence for a moment after they left. "I didn't know about the house plans," he finally said. "I swear, Mom." "I believe you," I said gently. "But you've allowed Stephanie to dictate our relationship for years. You've stood by while she's treated me with disrespect." "I know," he admitted, looking down at his hands. "It was easier to go along than to fight about it. She makes everything so difficult when she doesn't get her way." "And how is that working for you?" I asked. "Are you happy, David?" The question seemed to startle him. I don't know anymore." We talked for over 2 hours that afternoon. Really talked in a way we hadn't in years. David admitted he'd lost himself in his marriage, constantly compromising to keep peace. He confessed he missed our close relationship and felt guilty about how I'd been treated. "I need to think about a lot of things," he said as we finally prepared to leave. "But I want you to know I love you, Mom, and I'm sorry I let things get to this point." I squeezed his hand. "I love you too, son. That never changed even when it hurt." The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, I felt hope for genuine healing. The weeks following our confrontation were difficult but necessary. Stephanie initially refused to let me see Emma, but David insisted on bringing her for Sunday visits. These visits were awkward at first, with David acting as a buffer between Emma and me. But Emma's natural affection for her grandmother quickly melted any tension when we were together. David moved temporarily into their guest room, telling me he needed space to think about their relationship. He began seeing a therapist to understand how he had fallen into such unhealthy patterns. Our conversations became more honest and meaningful than they had been in years. "I never realized how much I'd changed," he confessed during one of our talks. "I kept making excuses for Stephanie's behavior because it was easier than confronting it." A month after our confrontation, I received an unexpected text from Grace, the nanny. She asked if we could meet for coffee, explaining that she had left her position with the family, but wanted to share some information she thought I should know. "Stephanie has been controlling David for years," Grace told me when we met. "She isolates him from anyone who doesn't reinforce her worldview. She did the same thing with her previous boyfriend. His family contacted me after I started working for them to warn me." Grace shared examples of how Stephanie manipulated situations, including deliberately scheduling activities to conflict with family events and then blaming the timing. She admitted that Stephanie had planned the Thanksgiving ambush weeks in advance, coaching Grace on what to say if I questioned their sudden departure. This information confirmed what I had suspected, but was still painful to hear. I thanked Grace for her honesty and wished her well in her new position. 3 months after our confrontation, David called to say that he and Stephanie had started couples counseling. I was cautiously optimistic, but realistic about the possibility of meaningful change. "Stephanie's agreed to work on her controlling behavior," David explained. "The therapist has helped her see some patterns from her own family dynamics that she's repeating." I kept my boundaries firm, despite the promising news. When they invited me to dinner at their home, I accepted, but made it clear I would leave if treated disrespectfully. To my surprise, Stephanie was civil, even making a visible effort to include me in conversations. It wasn't warmth, but it was progress. 6 months later, David arranged the first unsupervised visit with Emma. My granddaughter spent a whole Saturday with me baking cookies and planting spring bulbs in my garden. When David came to pick her up, he found us laughing together over a board game. "She's been talking about this visit all week," he said with a smile. "She adores you, Mom." Gradually, my relationship with Emma flourished. She began having regular overnight stays, and I became the grandmother I had always wanted to be, reading bedtime stories, teaching her to knit, sharing family history through old photographs and stories. My home became a neutral meeting ground with clear boundaries. I no longer tolerated criticism of my decor or lifestyle. When Stephanie made a disparaging comment about my outdated kitchen during one visit, I calmly said, "This kitchen has fed 3 generations with love. If you find it uncomfortable, we can meet elsewhere next time." To my surprise, she actually apologized. Over the next year, a new family dynamic slowly emerged. David found his voice and began standing up to Stephanie's controlling tendencies. It wasn't always smooth. There were setbacks and arguments, but the overall trajectory was toward healthier interactions. Stephanie gradually learned to respect boundaries, though I suspect it was more from realizing she had no choice rather than a fundamental change in attitude. Still, her behavior improved, which was what mattered most for Emma's sake. I joined a support group for grandparents navigating difficult family relationships, sharing my experience and learning from others. The group leader, a family therapist, often used my story as an example of how setting firm boundaries can sometimes save relationships rather than destroy them. "Lucille didn't just reclaim her house keys," she would say. "She reclaimed her dignity." Emma is 5 now and spends every other weekend with me. David and Stephanie's marriage has found a more balanced footing, though I can still see tensions beneath the surface. David seems happier and more like his old self, no longer walking on eggshells around his wife. Last month, we celebrated Thanksgiving together at my house again. This time, everyone stayed for the full meal, and Stephanie even brought a side dish she had prepared herself. It wasn't perfect, but it was respectful. As I watched Emma helping to set the table, carefully placing forks exactly where I showed her, I felt profound gratitude for the courage to stand up for myself 2 years ago. By refusing to be treated as a doormat, I had actually strengthened my family bonds rather than severing them. The most valuable lesson I learned through all of this is that sometimes the hardest boundary to set is with those we love most. We fear losing their love if we demand respect, but what I discovered is that relationships without respect aren't really love at all. They're obligation, habit, or convenience. Emma deserves to grow up seeing her grandmother treated with dignity. More importantly, she deserves to learn that she should expect dignity for herself. By standing firm, I was able to give her that example. The peace I've found isn't just about reclaiming my home from disrespect. It's about reclaiming my sense of self-worth. Frank would be proud of me, I think. And truthfully, I'm proud of myself. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members? What happened when you finally stood your ground? Share your experience in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more stories about finding strength in difficult family situations. And remember, it's never too late to teach people how you deserve to be treated. Thank you for listening to my story, and may you find the courage to stand up for yourself when necessary.